motion with respect to sheltering in place, so I'll look for a mover and a seconder.
Moved.
Okay, moved by Councillor Potts, seconded by Councillor Isett. Councillor Potts, go ahead.
So there is some new language. I'm just shuffling between screens that I sent to Mr. Coates this morning to address some of the legal concerns, or sorry, legal commentary on the, is that displayed on the screen now?
Yes, it is.
Yes. Okay.
And just before you continue, Mr. Coates, is what's on the screen the same thing as what's in our iPads?
No, it's not. We received this just before the meeting this morning.
Okay. Councillor Potts, do you mind before you motivate if we can just have a chance to read it?
Absolutely.
No, this is not on the published agenda, so this is just here.
Okay, so what's on the screen is the thing that we should be looking at. Okay, and then will we update the public agenda afterwards?
Yes.
Okay, has everyone had a chance to read the motion? Okay, Councillor Potts, go ahead. You're first, Councillor Isett is second, and then I'm going to put myself on the speakers list after that. Councillor Potts, go ahead.
Great. So as we know, our provincial health officers have asked us to stay home to reduce spreading COVID-19. And for those who aren't able to stay home because they don't have a home, the directive is to shelter in place. So this is the position of the city as well, but there is still significant concern from people who live outside that the ambiguity that exists in the current bylaw and directives within the COVID-19 response park notice enables enforcement through bylaw officers to continue to have discretion to impound and impose shelters or homes or other possessions. And this is particularly challenging in the time of reduced services and access to services for people who are unhoused. So there's concern that despite the best intentions of sheltering in place, that current directives have and will continue to lead to displacement, or will have the effect of pushing people far into the margins and out of touch with outreach workers and a community that can keep them safe. So we had a letter from the BC Civil Liberties Association on the issue, and it says something that I find important, that a crucial aspect of the rule of law is that the law must be knowable, and that is boundaries of the law must be sufficiently specified so that they are known in advance of the government's use of coercive power. So the intention of this motion really is to provide clarity and existing direction of bylaw and to address the unintended harms stemming from the directives within COVID-19 response parks notice that may lead to displacement or individuals' belongings or homes being disposed of. So the first motion just asks us to affirm our position following public health direction. 2A asks bylaw to allow for a reasonable period of notice before anything is removed from a site or a person's living space. Under our own property maintenance bylaws, an owner is required to prevent their property from becoming unsightly, but I believe they have months to address this issue. 72 hours allows people to have agency within the maintenance of their living space. It allows them to conform to direction and ensures that occupied shelters or belongings are not unduly removed or enforced. Enforcement of bylaws do not result in individuals' displacement from shelter. It also removes that challenging aspect of individual discretion to determine what's abandoned, what's waste, and provide some certainty and clarity for folks who are they have no other recourse than to live outside with all their belongings. And 2B With that, I think it's important for us to recognize the undue burden there is on people with reduced access to services without inside sheltering or a respite space under duress of a dual public health emergency to be concerned about their belongings being disposed of or leaving them without shelter if they're unable to adhere to bylaws, which very reasonably could be challenging due to the given exponential precarity of living outside currently. Recognizing there's potentially complications regarding COVID, but if something's being touched to be disposed of, the risk of contact has already been made. Wrapping those items in plastic for storage would be that post that same contact. And I would suggest then reasonably could be stored. If and options for open air storage could be explored. In the midst of the pandemic, like I could do such high risk things as get prepared food delivered safely to my home. Personal services are opening up and people are heading back to work. So I think our skilled staff can safely administer this. And the last is just number 3. I think this one's fairly explanatory, and I do applaud the efforts of bylaw through Shannon Perkins and the direction that they've been making on maintaining and improving dialogue between all the folks on the ground there.
Thank you very much. I've got Councillor Izett and then myself.
I support this motion, which I brought forward with a couple of colleagues, and I appreciate Councillor Potts' leadership on this item. I also appreciate the input we've received from members of the public and from organizations, including the BC Civil Liberties Association and others. I think it's important to ensure that the city's approach to sheltering outdoors is consistent with respect for human rights. I think some of the ambiguity arising from some communications has caused concern for people sheltering outdoors, as well as for people who advocate on their behalf. And so I think having council provide clarification of what kind of policy we would like to see with respect to the regulation of outdoor sheltering is important at this time. And I hope that a majority of council members will support the recommendations.
Okay, thank you. I've got a proposed amendment, and then I have a proposal for number B. So staff, can you scroll up so I can see number 1? So I'd like to add additional language after that council reaffirms the existing direction. So I want then to insert the words for the duration of the provincial state of emergency. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Young. So I think that this is why we've suspended the provision of people having to take down their tents, which I fully support. And we've done it because there's a provincial state of emergency. And as long as that provincial state of emergency is in place, I think that this should be our policy. When the provincial state of emergency is lifted, we'll see where we go next. And that's either we change the bylaws or staff go back to their normal practice of enforcing them. Maybe by that time, the 90 people on the list who aren't at Topaz and Pandora will be housed, depending on how long this state of emergency lasts, which could be quite some time. But I think this gives clarity to this motion, which has come up because of a state of emergency and should be in place as long as the state of emergency exists. Councillor Young is a seconder for
Mayor helps.
Yeah, I'll go to Councillor Young and then Councillor Potts and then Councillor Izett on the amendment.
Well, it already contains those words at the end of the first paragraph.
Oh.
I seconded it because I'm assuming that maybe the reading, the application of the timing isn't as clear as it could be, but
yeah, sorry, obviously not if I didn't even kind of catch that. So I wanted to put it at the beginning for clarity. If it's at the end, it doesn't matter to me. So I can just withdraw that amendment as long as that's the understanding. Well, actually, sorry. Yeah, okay. I'm going to. It's not the public health emergency, it's the provincial state of emergency. The public health emergency may in fact be declared over before the province declares the state of emergency over. So I think the state of emergency is the appropriate language. I don't care if it's at the beginning or the end, but it should be the provincial state of emergency because that's the official piece of legislation or order from the government that we're operating under. So I guess I'm going to stick with the amendment. I don't care if it goes at the beginning or the end, but I think it should say provincial state of emergency rather than public health emergency. So Councillor Young, as a seconder, are you?
Yeah, I agree with that. The words should probably be struck out at the end of the.
Yeah, exactly. And to strike, I mean, that would be the follow-up of the amendment. It doesn't need to be a separate, that would be the result of the amendment, so, and strike the words at the end. Okay, Councillor Potts, did you want to just point that same thing out to me that had been pointed out, or did you want to add something further?
I did want to point that out, but following, is the direction to shelter in place part of the state of emergency or a public health directive to reduce the risk of spreading COVID?
There's actually no direction to shelter in place. There's a direction to stay at home if you're sick, but unlike California and other places, there never was a direction to shelter in place. It was a direction to stay at home if you're sick. So there's no.
I wonder about why we would change sheltering in place along the lines of the state of emergency and not along the lines of the public health emergency.
Mr. Zaworski, are there two actual provincial orders?
Mayor Helps, my understanding is that there is only a provincial state of emergency that has been ordered. There's been advisories under the Public Health Act. There have been orders under Public Health Act related to gatherings of 50 or more people. So those are actual orders of the public health officer. But majority of the orders have been made under the Emergency Program Act by a minister pursuant to the declaration of the state of provincial emergency. So legally, the current situation we're in is a state of provincial emergency declared under the Emergency Program Act.
Thank you. Councillor Potts, anything further?
No.
Okay, and just for clarity, if staff could strike for the duration of the public health emergency as part of the amendment, so it's to move the words up and strike those and make sure we're using the right provincial order, not something more vague. Councillor Isett on the amendment, and then Councillor Dubois.
I think it would be good to get clarification. As one of the sponsors of this motion, the intent was to align our practices with the public health advice, and it was sort of either tangential or, in some ways, the Solicitor General's orders had nothing to do with this. It was more about the health of people who are unhoused. So it might be good just to get clarification on. I'm trying to think back to the provincial health officer's original orders, and if that did reference some sort of an emergency, whether it was a formally declared emergency or some other situation that had prompted her to make her orders. And I think Council's motion should align with that advice rather than whatever whims the Solicitor General may or may not have.
Okay, Mr. Zaworski.
Mayor Helps, I'm trying to look this up so I don't have to advise council based on my memory. Unfortunately, my computer is a little bit slow at the moment. But my understanding, and I'll try to confirm it right now, is that there have been advisories issued by the public health officer that included the shelter sort of in place kind of advisory. That is not an order. The public health officer also issued orders regarding the prohibiting gatherings of 50 people or more, and prohibiting certain establishments from being open. My recollection is that there has been no declaration of a public health emergency. Instead, there's been a declaration of the provincial state of emergency under the Emergency Program Act by the Solicitor General, rather than under the Public Health Act by the public health officer. But I will try to confirm it in the next few minutes.
That would be very helpful. Yeah, Councillor Isett still has the floor, and then Councillor Dubois.
Yeah, it looks like it's a little hard to find on the provincial website, but it looks like it's defining the outbreak as a health hazard under the Public Health Act. So I wonder if we could use that language, and council could always change its direction, but The whole motivation behind this is that there's people who are unhoused who are feeling not safe. And I think to take a light touch is a lighter touch is the motivation. And I think it would be, any council member would be free to adjust the direction, or staff could proactively bring a report when either the provincial health officer or the Solicitor General's guidance changes. So I'm going to propose an amendment to the amendment for the duration of the health hazard under the Public Health Act identified by the provincial health officer.
Okay, is there a seconder?
I'll second that for discussion.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Councillor Isaac, and then Councillor Potts, and then I'd like to add something.
Yeah, I think for me the provincial emergency is too high a bar for this. I think if this is about the health of some of the most vulnerable members of our community, and I think that the health guidance is what we should look to. I think, as I said, if this amendment were to pass and the subsequent amendment and the main motion, there'd be nothing preventing council or staff from revisiting the issue at any time.
Okay, Councillor Potts on the amendment to the amendment.
Yeah, I'm just having a bit of trouble pulling up this information on the provincial website, but I am able to find news articles from March 17th. BC Provincial Health Officer Bonnie Henry declares a public health emergency. And we have several conversations around we're under a dual public health emergency. So I think that is something that's in play, and I think it would be important before we move on from this item, or to come back to this item with clarification on that.
Okay, thank you. And I agree, clarity is absolutely important. I think the motivation, and I support this, by the way, I support number one, and I think it's good practice for public health. What Councillor Potts said in her motivation is what made me think that it needed to be amended to add the provincial, or to reference the provincial state of emergency. The BC Civil Liberties Association saying that the law needs to be clear. So that the only clear piece of law that we have is the provincial state of emergency. What Bonnie Henry said on March 17th when she declared a public health emergency, that those are, with all due respect to Dr. Henry, those are just words. What matters is the provincial state of emergency that we find ourselves in. So is it still, are we still in a public health emergency? Is it still a health hazard under the Public Health Act when I could get a haircut yesterday? Like, these are very fluid things. The provincial state of emergency is very not fluid. So in the interest of making everyone clear about what exactly we're saying and when exactly this provision that we're putting in place could end. And again, as Councillor Isaac says, it could, the province could lift its state of emergency, and then we could say, okay, well, we still think this is important for another reason. But to me, we need to be absolutely clear. So I'm against the amendment to the amendment. I think, unless Mr. Zaworski tells us something differently, and I agree with Councillor Potts, we need clarity, that it should simply read for the duration of the provincial state of emergency. So that's my take on the amendment to the amendment. Councillor Dubois on the amendment to the amendment.
I have a trouble of the way we use language. I understand we say in the public health order, but this has been public health crisis way before this crisis came. And we're talking about people's rights. So the unhoused community, like any other community, have the right to be treated with dignity and afforded the same respect and care as everyone else. So we have the responsibility to this community to assure the incumbent have their basic needs, and that's what we are discussing about, such as hygiene, sanitation, waste management, and other basic services as human rights. So that's why I have a problem with the language, because this has been crisis way before coronavirus came.
Thank you. Mr. Zaworski, do you have any more clarity for us about the appropriate language in this motion?
Mayor House, I've been unable to prove the negative that there's been no public health emergency declared. I can't find any reference to it. The only declaration that I can locate and I'm aware of is the provincial state of emergency. So if council is looking for a definitive a sort of a mechanism by which to tell when these directions are to expire. The amendment as proposed to add the reference to the provincial state of emergency is appropriate, because that will be something that we will all know when it is lifted, if it is or when it is. So it provides sort of a definitive point. Will that state of emergency be lifted only after the health hazard is over? Obviously, I don't know, and it's impossible to tell. But health hazard is a more ambiguous term. So from the perspective of certainty, certainly the amendment and reference to provincial state of emergency is preferable.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Young on the amendment?
Well, of course, I'm not in favor of it for the reasons that have been stated. We wouldn't know when it was triggered. It's far too low a bar using the wording that's there. I suspect there will be a health hazard from COVID for not weeks, not months, but years, until 90% of the population is vaccinated or some such event. So unless we want this to go on forever, which may be the wish of some, I think we have to reject the wording. I wasn't going to raise it at this point, but Councillor Izett has raised this issue of the advice from public health officials. No public health official, to my knowledge, has said, I want you to establish a string of tents along Pandora on the green space. I want you to have a tent camp in Beacon Hill Park, or even I want you to have a tent camp at Topaz. There clearly was concern about personal spacing. I think that our staff, and I'm sure some councillors agreed, felt that allowing the suspension of the bylaws to allow permanent camping in these various locations was a way of responding to that desire. But if it had been in order, we'd see tent camps in Uplands Park, in Esquimalt, in Saanich, in Langford. We'd see camping in Goldstream Park, where the province has said you can't go and camp, you have to camp on Pandora or in Topaz. Go figure, as if that made some kind of sense from the point of view of spacing. This was totally our internal interpretation of the warnings of the health officers, and this is on us, the establishment of these tent camps. And as I say, I'm not even clear. It refers to existing direction. I'm not clear that there's been a motion by council to suspend these bylaws, but certainly it has been an accepted direction to go. But I think saying that this is consistent with advice of public health officials to reduce the risk of transmission, I think is going way too far. I think anybody observing activities at Topaz and in Pandora would say it's not at all clear that it has been reducing the risk of transmission, which fortunately has not materialized in any case. But if this motion is to mean anything, it's certainly we have to reject this amendment to the amendment.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to call the question on the amendment to the amendment. If there is a public health emergency, then we will use that language rather than something vague, in my opinion. But yeah, Councillor Izett and then Councillor Dubois.
So I don't think it's...
Can I get on to this too?
Yeah, Councillor
I
Potts.
don't think it's vague under Section 30 of the Public Health Act. It's Division 4, orders respecting health hazards and contraventions. And then the subheading, when orders respecting health hazards and contraventions may be made. So Section 30, subsection 1, a health officer may issue an order under this division only if the health officer reasonably believes that a health hazard exists. And then there's further provision. So it doesn't have the same time limitation as a provincial or a local state of emergency, so it's less precise than the Emergency Programs Act, but it is still a statutory power that the provincial health officer has. And so there is some basis for us tying our own procedures to that. An alternate approach, I think, could be a fixed date. For example, it could be set to June 25th, 2020, and that council would review the matter on that date. So that would be another approach. But I personally think that if the province doesn't renew their emergency order in 4 days, that would be totally unreasonable and unacceptable in terms of the insecurity and lack of safety that would expose the unhoused population to.
I see. I see where this is coming from. Yeah, Mr. Zaworski, do you have new information for us?
Mayor House, yes, it's still not absolutely certain, but I have been able to locate information that indicates that there was a public health emergency declared under Public Health Act. I haven't actually located the declaration itself yet, but it appears that there is one that was issued at the same time as the provincial state of emergency on March 17th.
Okay, so given that is sorry, this could be my fault for wasting all this time. So is the original language in the motion satisfactory? Will there be a time when Bonnie Henry says, I'm undeclaring, in the same way that Minister Farnworth would say, I'm undeclaring?
I would expect that, yes. So if council wanted to change that from provincial state of emergency to the public health emergency, that perhaps would address
That
issue.
is what the original motion says. So that's that I'm proposing we adjust. So, okay, then on that basis, I propose we defeat all of the amendments and just go with this public health emergency, which presumably has some duration, which at some point when Dr. Henry feels is appropriate will then end. That seems more, I didn't realize that there was, that had been officially, that it had the same kind of status in legislation. So with that, apologies for wasting the table's time. Does anyone else wish to speak? Okay, so on the amendment to the amendment, all those in favor? All those opposed? We're all opposed.
No.
Oh,
I was in favor.
You're not in favor of the health hazard stuff.
I am.
We're on the amendment to the amendment. This is what you're vociferously opposed to.
Yeah. No, you're right. It's the health hazard. Sorry.
Okay, so we're all opposed to that. Now, Councillor Young may wish to vote in favor of the amendment I propose. That's his prerogative, but I will call the question. All those in favor of striking public health emergency and putting in provincial state of emergency? Councillor Young is in favor. All those opposed? The rest of us are opposed. Okay. So that remains. Sorry for the confusion. I think if we're confused, it's good that we've had this conversation so at least the public has clarity. With respect to point B, this was a late motion, and I expressed my concern, and I know we're in a pandemic and we have to act quickly, but I am going to propose that Part B, it's going to be a postponement motion of Part B, but I want to say my reason first why. And Councillor Isaac actually pointed this out when he made motivation for the original motion, that it was our intention to align our motion with public health advice. And so I asked Dr. Stanwyck for public health advice on whether it is actually safe to store belongings at this point. I did that yesterday afternoon when I saw this motion. He had said that they were going to ask their infectious disease specialist to write us a letter this morning. That letter hasn't come yet, so I would move that we postpone Part B until we have that letter from the infectious disease specialist. Is there a seconder? Okay, seconded by Councillor Alto. So postponement motions aren't debatable. Actually, I'll make it even clearer. I'll postpone until next Thursday, the 28th. So is that fine with you, Councillor Alto? Okay. So all those in favor of postponing Part B until we have that advice? Are there any opposed? Okay, Councillor Dubois and Isaac are opposed. Okay, so...
I'm also opposed.
Okay, and Councillor Potts is also, and Councillor Loveday is also opposed. Okay, so that fails then. So I still have the floor. I'm kind of rendered speechless by the defeat of that motion, that amendment. I actually was compelled by what Councillor Potts said. How hard is it to wrap up something? It needs to be touched anyways. It can just be wrapped in plastic. I feel very, very, very nervous about proceeding with B without public health advice. And I don't think that we should do that as a council. So I don't know what to do unless anyone has any suggestions. Not only, Councillor Isaac, I see your hand. Not only are we putting our staff at risk if we mandate this direction, but if there's not a safe way to store, or if COVID seeps through plastic, or, we could potentially have a whole bunch of people's belongings in a situation where they're touching each other and they are then dispersed back into the population, which may be infected. So I want to find a way to store people's belongings safely. So this isn't some cloaked opposition to this. I think we heard our bylaw, head of bylaw who's here, say that staff are also willing to do this, this work, but I am not willing to do this without public health advice. So if there were some reluctant opposers, but it's been defeated, so I'll cede the floor and look for some wisdom, but I cannot live with this direction. Councillor Isaac?
The wording, it's clear. It was Councillor Loveday who brought up the issue of worker safety as these recommendations were being drafted. And so it's saying that B only applies to the extent that it's consistent with workplace safety requirements. And that's a determination that the administration would make. And there's a clear duty of employers to ensure worker safety. And across a whole range of sectors in the last week, for the whole reopening plan, it's being driven through a worker safety lens. So whether that means obtaining formal advice from medical officers or obtaining information from elsewhere, that's, I think, a part of the due diligence of the city as an employer. And so I think it is a supportable policy because it includes that worker safety provision.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Young, Councillor Thornton-Joe, Councillor Alto. Essentially, there's no amendment on the table, just so we're clear. So anyone can speak on any part of the motion. We're focused on B right now, but the whole motion is properly on the table. Councillor Young, you have the floor.
Well, I'm opposed to the entire direction of the motion, particularly now that the language has been changed from the provincial emergency to the public health emergency. I suspect that for a very considerable period of time, the provincial health officer may wish to make motions or take actions, and any action that she takes, whether it's to prevent a national convention of doctors or to require masks being worn by tattoo artists, anything that she feels is necessary, I suspect may require her using her powers under the public health emergency. That it may easily happen that public health, that she will want to take actions for a year and a half. It could easily be a year before a vaccine is even proven. So I think we have to, we should be acting in a way that leads us to consider what we want this city to look like over the foreseeable future. And once again, we have made an interpretation of what is required, that an interpretation that results in our streets being lined with tents where nobody else's streets are being lined with tents, and our parks being used as campgrounds while the provincial campgrounds aren't even being used by anybody. So clearly, our interpretations are way different from everybody else's, and we are shouldering far more of the burden than anybody else. And I think the question now is whether we want our major parks to be used as campgrounds over the next couple of years. And it isn't as if we are walking into some unknown territory. We have had campgrounds, and we know what happens there. They quickly devolve. Once we have permanent campgrounds, we have all of the issues of fire safety, barbecues, propane tanks, shelters. We have the issues of stolen property being stored, people going into the tent camps to find their bicycle, get the police to come and unbolt the bicycle so they can take it away. This happened at the courthouse. People go in, they confront the people who've stolen their property and try and get it back. We know we've had instances of violence, of exploitation of youth. Why would we be walking into this knowingly? That's what's so unbelievable to me, that we know where we're going and we still want to go there. Our bylaw officers are having enough trouble keeping things in order now with the rules we have, and to extend these rules to give even more latitude to people to have leave their tents up for long periods of time, to establish more and bigger tents, to have their property stored for them. I mean, just walking through the tent camps, as I'm sure we all have, and looked into the bins to see all the wonderful, expensive tents that people have donated being chucked away, and all of the massive material that's gathered there. But for us to be gathering up those tents and sleeping bags, and in many cases, I suspect, property of unknown origin, and carefully tagging it and storing it, just totally impractical, but also just making it a lot easier to leave everything in place indefinitely. And we don't want to go there, or shouldn't want to go there. The people who live around these places have told us they don't want to go there, and this entire motion should be defeated. And I think we should really be starting to think about how we can shift the balance of tolerance a little toward requiring more expectations on the part of those who are camping in our camps rather than less.
Thank you. I have Councillor Thornton-Joe and Councillor Alto, and then I'll look for other speakers.
Thank you. I appreciate the movers in what they were trying to address, but I think I have a couple issues regarding the motions for several reasons. One, that we're being asked to adopt something, but I'm often, when motions like this come forward, we get staff to come back, or we actually have staff are able to answer the questions regarding pieces. So, for example, the 72 hours, and I don't know whether I should be asking Ms. Perkins to come up.
Ms. Perkins is here to answer our questions, and so she's got a microphone. And just before I go to Ms. Perkins, the practice that's being outlined here, with the exception of A and B, number one, if you can scroll up, this is what bylaw are already doing. This is a staff direction. That's why I'm kind of frustrated. Staff are already doing this.
Yeah. So my frustration is, okay, maybe I can just underline them. Some of my frustration is making a decision when we're trying to interpret the public health emergency versus the state of emergency. And I almost want clarification of what that means and who would rescind or who would. So that's my first piece. The second piece I have is on the first, number one. So I understand up to the brackets outside of Topaz and Pandora. So is that my understanding that people would still be able to camp at Topaz and Pandora for the duration of is that what the brackets is, or no?
It's not clear because
So that's where I'm concerned. I'm voting on something that I'm not clear about. The difference between state of emergency and health emergency, what is referred to in Topaz and Pandora, the 72 hours, which I'll probably ask Ms. Perkins, the pros and cons of that amount of time. The B, do we have, do staff feel we have location to do this? And although workplace safety is mentioned in the motion and definitely is paramount, my issue during COVID is health safety. So WorkSafe they may be able to wear material that that makes the staff safe, but if the items are put in a place that they can contaminate each other, this doesn't address the cross-contamination for our most vulnerable population. So I just have, I either don't vote for any, or we wordsmith every piece, or I'm just having trouble. I understand the intent from the movers, but I have trouble with it as worded. So maybe my first question to Ms. Perkins, where it says 72 hours, is there any rationale that makes it supportable or not supportable in your opinion?
Okay, and Ms. Perkins, before you answer, I don't think anyone has trouble with number 3, so can we just have the motion on the screen displayed so that we can all see 1 and 2? Okay, that's great, thank you. Ms. Perkins, go ahead.
Through the mayor, initially when COVID came upon us, we wanted to halt the practice of impounding abandoned property. So the tag was a way of seeing if someone could claim the property so that we wouldn't have to, and actually it's been very successful. We haven't thrown out anybody's personal belongings that haven't been exposed to hazardous waste. The con of making it 72, the only thing that could potentially be a problem is it could invite pilfering from other people, potentially, just being there for so long. But really, we're not actually returning to these abandoned properties usually every 24 hours in all cases. Sometimes they will sit for a couple of days because we haven't had a chance to get back to them. So I don't see anything particularly troubling with the 72 hours.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Perkins, in number 1, is that clear of what number 1 means, especially with the brackets of outside of Topaz and Pandora? Because I know often we ask the staff if they understand, if the motion is clear to them.
I'm just going to walk up here, sorry.
Could I potentially explain what that means?
Sure, and that workstation has been sanitized, so you can feel free to sit down. Councillor Potts, while Ms. Perkins is getting up to speed on the new motion that's here, you can explain for Councillor Thornton-Joe.
For most of this, actually, this has been sent. Ms. Perkins has seen most of this, as well as Mr. Zaworski. The Topaz and Pandora delineates where bylaw is acting through the city, and where Topaz and Pandora are distinct sites that were operated through the province and are not designated camping sites. So we're talking about where people are already allowed to camp in the city. Does that provide clarity?
Yeah, I think the province is, the problem is that it reads, in locations where overnight sheltering is permitted outside of Topaz and Pandora. Technically, sheltering is still permitted by our Parks bylaw in Topaz, and technically it's never been permitted on Pandora. So I think that's part of the confusion. I think we all get the intention, but Ms. Perkins, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, thank you. That's where my concerns are.
Okay. Ms. Perkins?
No, it's clear to me. It's just in areas that are already permitted for sheltering.
So that would mean, so almost you would take out outside of Topaz and Pandora, because Topaz is permitted, but Pandora isn't. So I think.
Although Topaz isn't permitted right now by a provincial order, not our
Yes.
parks bylaw. So
Then with my understanding, then outside of towpaths due to provincial order and Pandora.
sure, if you want to make amendments so that you're clear and comfortable, that's fine. You can do that. You have the floor.
Okay, I'll hold off for that in a sec, but and then my next question, I guess, would be B, I guess to, I don't know if it would be our Public Works or where would this be impound? Okay, thank you.
Through the mayor, the impound location is at the Garbly location and also on one of the parkades.
And is there any concerns that you might have for what the motion says and the 30 days?
I have some questions on how to accomplish it. I would definitely like to receive some direction on how to accomplish that so that there isn't any cross-contamination and that it's done safely. But if we can get that direction, I don't have any problems with B.
Which probably might come by Dr. Stanwyck's letter. Okay, I'm not going to do an amendment yet. I want to hear what others say before I make that amendment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Alto and then Councillor Isaac.
Thanks for this. It's a very complicated conversation. Generally speaking, I'm supportive of the direction I think this is going in and the intent that I think is behind it. But I think that there are some improvements that could be made through a number of amendments. And the one in particular that I would start with is in 2B. Since the earlier amendment or motion was defeated, perhaps an amendment that would go after the word requirements, workplace safety requirements, before the comma. If we added language, something along the lines of consistent with workplace safety requirements and the advice of local public health authorities.
Sure. Great. Seconded by Councillor Isaac.
And just to briefly motivate on that, I think that with that there, that will indicate that, to me anyway, and maybe I'm wrong, so feedback on this, to me that would indicate that this would not happen until that advice from Dr. Stanwyck was received, which is likely very soon. If the mayor's conversations were today and yesterday, and he indicated that it was coming shortly, it'll be in the next few days at the most. And I think it is important for us to hear what that advice is. Dr. Stanwyck has been involved with issues like this for years and will be able to provide, I think, very practical advice on how this could be accomplished in a way which protects the workers under the workplace safety requirements, but also protects the people whose belongings these are, which is one of the, I think, significant and realistic questions of how to ensure that these belongings, should they be retrieved, do not cross-contaminate individuals unintentionally. So I think that this is a simple, relatively simple, and I hope practical amendment that would address some of those issues. I'll stop there, and then I have something else to suggest after we deal with this.
Councillor Isaac, do you wish to speak on the amendment?
I support this. I had been thinking about revised wording, but I think this accomplishes the direction I was going to propose that council look to go.
Okay, thank you. And Councillor Alto, I appreciate this. This also accomplishes what I was trying to accomplish. Workplace safety requirements are one thing, and that's fine, but I'm sure that WorkSafe BC is not putting out guidelines for how to deal with vulnerable people's belongings. They're just not going to do that. They're doing hairdressers and everything else. So I think the advice of the public health authorities is what we should be seeking on this one. So I support the amendment and thank you for making it. Is there discussion on the amendment? Yeah, Councillor Isaac, Loveday.
Yeah, very supportive of this. The difference here is that I think council should give the direction that this is the policy we want to see happen, if it can happen safely. And so this will make sure that it only happens if it happens safely. But if it can happen safely, we decide today that that's the direction we want to give.
Thank you. I'm going to call the question on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment? Are there any opposed? Okay, none are opposed. The amendment carries. Councillor Alto, you still have the floor.
Thank you. Going back up to the very top and item 1, and I think it might overlap into item 2. Just hearkening back to our conversation about the confusion around the public health emergency, provincial state of emergency, various states of emergency for different reasons. I think it was Councillor Isaac who floated the potential idea earlier, though not with a motion, that perhaps an easier to understand approach would be to replace the words "for the duration of the public health emergency" with a date, at which time, should we be able to arrive on some agreement about an appropriate date, we could easily reconsider this to extend it, just as we've done with a variety of other proposals around, simple things like parking and other stuff. So I'm going to try an amendment that replaces in item 1 those words at the end "for the duration of the public health emergency" with, I think the date that was mentioned earlier was about a month from now, which I think was June 25th. And if there's a seconder for that, I'll talk briefly.
Seconded by Councillor Thornton-Joe.
Okay. So it's there, and I think probably for consistency, it would need to also be the same thing done in item number 2 as well, at the end of that first opening sentence there. Would likely, or I guess anywhere in this where it says the public health emergency would probably need to be replaced. I'm not 100% happy about this, honestly, because I do think there's been some extremely important comments made about the reality of public health emergencies, as well as the whole issue of the provincial declaration of a state of emergency. On the other hand, I do think it's important to recognize that, as we've said many times in this chamber over the last couple of months, this is a circumstance for which we were unprepared and which we are learning how to deal with day by day. And that obviously, moving forward, we're going to be having to make some decisions quickly, periodically, and sometimes unexpectedly. And that in all of those things, one of the aspects that helps us make those decisions is simplicity and clarity. And I think sticking a date in, and I'm not wedded to this date, it could be a different date, a later date, at least gives us the sense of saying, okay, here's where we're going, here's the policy, here's what we want to achieve, and we're going to do this until X date, and at that time we're going to revisit where we are, and if it looks like it needs to be continued, great. And if we can amend it in some way to make it better at that time, then we'll do that. But for me, I think just listening to the confusion that's been expressed in the chamber, to what I expect will be translated into confusion in the public, that inserting a simple date here, and again, I'm not wedded to this particular one, it was just one that was referenced earlier, I think will bring some clarity to that situation and give us decision points in the future, as well as having understandable and clear messages for the public about how and when this will be applied. So I'm happy to hear other people's comments, and I do have one more thought after we deal with this proposal.
Thank you. Councillor Thornton-Joe as the seconder to the amendment.
No, I appreciate that. That really does help with some clarity, and not only from anything that we approve has to be clear that we can explain it to the public as well. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also very supportive of this for a couple of reasons. One is, call it what you like, but we are still in a provincial state of emergency, and I don't personally see that emergency being lifted anytime soon, but I'm not the premier, so I don't know. But just like we're revisiting parking at the end of June, we can revisit this. There are some things that are interim that we're going to have to keep revisiting, as tiresome or cumbersome as it might be. But I do think that setting a date, and I appreciate Councillor Alto picking the date that Councillor Isaac had already pitched, because I like best when we're collaborating here at the table, that this is a sound way to go. It gives everybody clarity, and it forces us to keep this issue top of mind to make sure that we're taking all of our roles as the local government during a provincial state of emergency seriously. So I support this, and I particularly appreciate the spirit from which it's come from this discussion. Does anyone want to comment on the amendment? Okay, I'm going to call the question.
Councillor Potts?
Yeah, Councillor Potts, yeah, go ahead.
Happy to support the amendment, but with the caveat that the reason that I intended to affirm this is that if people get sick, they still need somewhere to self-isolate for 14 days, and that risk is not gone. And I don't want for us to be in a position where we don't have that option. We're not talking about a tent city. We're not talking about inflated numbers. We know people live in Beacon Hill Park. We're talking about the people that live there now and their ability to protect themselves from what we don't know is still going to come. And thinking and keeping in mind that services are still not available for these people. Topaz is closing down. Those services are moving elsewhere. They're going into hotels. But the regular centers where people go to access services and connect with community are not. open yet. We don't know when they'll be open again. And so we have to be really mindful of the impacts on this already vulnerable community.
Thank you for that, Councillor Potts. Just to make sure that our motion is properly in order, it's now 2 o'clock on the dot, so I need a motion to extend the meeting till, I would say, till 2:15. I think we're close. Is there a seconder for 2:15? Okay, seconded by Councillor Alto. For the public who wonders why we're doing that, our bylaw says our meeting needs to end at 2 o'clock, so I'll call the question on extending the meeting. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. On the amendment to put until June 25th, 2020 to be revisited at that time. Okay, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? None are opposed. That carries. Councillor Alto, you still have the floor.
Thank you. And just lastly, just actually similarly, I guess I could have done it before, is I think that I need to move that same language at the end of the opening sentence in number 2 to replace during the public health emergency.
That was the intent. You don't need to do it. You said it when you were making the amendment.
Sorry.
So basically, anytime we say public health emergency, we're doing until June 25th, and then
Is
we'll
it
review.
anywhere? I don't think it's anywhere else.
Staff will catch it if it is.
Okay. And so I guess just lastly then, right. And then lastly then on that, and thank you for that consideration. I appreciate that, Council. I wonder if there needs to be a specific reference, as you mentioned, Mayor Helps, in those two same places to reference a to be revisited at that time. Or
It's essentially going to land on our June 25th agenda with this motion.
Okay. So I think that's it for formal motions for me. And I just wanted to add, generally speaking, that I think it's important for us to acknowledge that these are really hard decisions. And there's nobody at this table, or virtually or in person, who isn't struggling mightily with the complexities of this. And I think we need to acknowledge that difficulty in council, at staff levels, throughout the organization. And it's important for me, anyway, to acknowledge and thank my colleagues, elected and not. There are a lot of leaders in this room. And I think we all need to remember that sometimes that leadership is harder than we ever imagined, and this is one of those times. So I thank you all for your indulgence in that.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to speak? Councillor Isaac.
I think the report back's valuable, and I think a little bit of direction to staff on what information council could benefit from on the 25th. So I guess I'm going to move, and Mr. Coates, is it a 3-part motion right now? Yeah, so a new item 4, that staff report to council on June 25th with an update on sheltering in parks as well as indoor sheltering options.
Okay, is there a seconder? Okay, I think seconded for discussion.
I think council could put more shape on what we'd like to see in the report, but what I would hope to see is we would hear from staff on the current state of sheltering in parks, what staff's thinking is in terms of the approach, whether stay the course or shift the approach from what's outlined in this main motion, and also staff's approach for over the last few months, but also an update on where our partners are at in terms of providing indoor sheltering options with supports.
Okay, Councillor Dubois is the seconder, and then I have an amendment for clarity.
Yeah, for me, I will defer my comments later. I think this doesn't go as far as I wished, but it helps us that for the future, we can revisit this discussion, and if we want to strengthen it, then we can bring something forward. So it gives us that opportunity.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to add language, just to clarify what Councillor Isaac has said the intention is. So I'm just going to read it, and I'll say when the amendment begins, that staff report back to Council on June 25th with an update on sheltering in parks, as well as, and here's the language, a report from partners on opportunities for indoor sheltering. Okay, thank you. Seconded by Councillor Thornton-Joe. This to me gives more clarity. It's not that we're directing staff to go find indoor sheltering opportunities, because I think that's A, not realistic, and B, I think as the police chief said, Ms. Jenkins has done a really good job gently pushing and reminding and working with our partners about that role. So Yeah, I don't think I need to say any more, except to make sure the language is there, a report from partners on opportunities for indoor sheltering. Yes, so did someone, Councillor Thornton-Joe seconded, yeah, Councillor Dubeau? Okay, sorry, Councillor Thornton-Joe, do you want to comment?
I'm fine.
Okay, Councillor Dubeau?
I don't know how to ask this. Are we done for amendment over amendment, or
Yes, at this point we are,
to the max?
to the max.
Okay.
Okay, so on adding the language, a report from partners on opportunities for indoor sheltering, all those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed? Okay, so now we just have an amendment, Councillor Dubeau. You can make an amendment to, and we're on this number 4 now.
I'm wondering let me motivate my intention, then see how the wording will look like. If the staff is going to report on June 25th on sheltering in parks, I wonder what it would look like also, the staff to report back what the bylaw enforcement. Because
Yeah, that's part of it. That's already happening. Yeah, go up to number 1, scroll up to number 1. We've amended number 1 to read that they're going to be reporting back on June 25th.
And just out of curiosity, with this direction and suspending the bylaw, what will be the difference?
Just to clarify, we're not suspending the bylaw.
Yeah, I know that, but
Okay.
I'm asking a question, what difference and direction would the staff receive? Out of curiosity. Then I can know what I'm voting on, so.
Just, it's really important to me that and Mr. Zaworski reminded of this, us of this by email. We're simply, number 1 is simply affirming the direction that staff have already been taking, so as that we're not meddling in staff operations.
I totally understand. And my question is coming out of curiosity, and I know that is not the direction right now in front of the council, but I want to know what will it say to you as a staff if that was the case?
Through the mayor, just so I think I understand what you're saying, is you're asking me what different direction I'll give to staff as a result of this motion being carried today?
If the motion was to suspend the bylaw, that in order to ask such a question?
No, because we can't suspend a bylaw. We can change a bylaw, or staff can use their discretion as they've been doing under the state of a public health emergency, but we can't, there's no such thing as suspending a bylaw. Mr. Zaworski, I don't know if you want to add anything, but.
Mayor Helps, that's correct. So what council is doing right now essentially is providing direction to staff in terms of on how to enforce the bylaw, which at the moment, the practice, as I understand it, and Ms. Perkins can confirm this, has been not to enforce the requirement to take shelters down at 7 a.m. In relation to people sheltering, people who experience homelessness sheltering in the parks. That's been the practice for the last 2 months. And as I understand, motion number 1 is council is endorsing that practice and directing staff to continue with this practice at least until at least June 25th.
So in English, so if we say do not reinforce, and if we say suspend, what is the difference in English? I know we're not in English class, but I really want to understand the difference if we say in suspend and do not reinforce. What is the difference?
Well, from the legal perspective, the difference is that this is a general direction to staff in terms of the bylaw enforcement, but ultimately bylaw officers retain discretion, and so the bylaw is still in effect, the prohibition is still there. So if the tent or a structure or presented some other hazard or problem, the bylaw can still be enforced. It is still in effect. But a general direction from staff, from council to staff is for the health emergency reasons, do not enforce it until June, at least until June 25th. And so it doesn't make this legal. It simply means that it will not be enforced at this time.
And would this leave the discretion of the officer? And would it be, if this was not here now, and what you were already doing, what is the difference if you already have the discretion to do what you are already doing? And that's where my confusion is coming from.
Well, correct. We've been exercising our discretion not to ask people to take their tents down. So that was a discretionary decision by the bylaw manager, mine, and direction given to the officers. This just reaffirms that existing direction.
Okay, so if I hear correctly, this is just reaffirmation, but does not change the discretion of the officer.
The discretion, it always remains. We will follow council direction.
But I'm again confused. Earlier you said this is reaffirmation, means it reaffirms what we already doing, but it doesn't suspend or stops reinforcement if the officer wants to do that, as a policy-wise.
Well, I direct the officers to follow council direction, and so they will.
Okay. It's good to hear that you're affirming that, but I really have a trouble of discretion in terms of not having a clear direction to the staff. That even creates confusion for the staff. And that's my personal opinion.
Thank you. I think the reason, and any of the movers can correct me if I'm wrong, the reason that this is here today is because we've been getting substantial correspondence from members of the public who are concerned about the perceived or real perception, reality. I'm not going to, everyone has their own perception of the situation, of how the bylaw is being interpreted. My opinion is that Ms. Perkins and her team, with the exception of the 24 hours versus 72 hours, have been doing this. My opinion is that other than changing from 24 to 72 hours and the movement towards or the ability to hold people's belongings. So I think we're walking a very fine line here. And I think, again, and the Premier said this, and I appreciated his honesty. He said, we're in a state of emergency like one that we've never seen, and we don't know what we're doing sometimes, and we're making it up as we go. I think this is one instance where we're making it up as we go. Bylaw used common sense, I would say, a great deal of compassion, care, listening to public health advice, and just simply did the right thing by not making people take down their tents. And so what we're doing today is we're affirming that direction. We're going to get a report back. We've given some additional direction for how this, so we're really walking a fine line. I think, I see your hand, Councillor Dubois. I'm just going to finish my remarks. So I think there's no us and them here. There's no staff versus council versus the community. I think between bylaw and council and the community, everyone's concerned about the needs of the most vulnerable population who, in a health pandemic, living outside must be terribly frightening and not very safe feeling. So that's why we're all here. And I think that's why the motion in the way that it's landed here has landed at our table. I'm very prepared to support it and to revisit it and to get a report back from staff. But I want to look Ms. Perkins in the eye and thank her for her incredible leadership and the way that she's and her officers have worked through this very, very difficult situation. Councillor Dubois, I'll go back to you and then I'll call the question.
Just for my clarity, someone who has worked a lot in human rights, for me, it was never about an officer or about the staff. It was always about the policy and the city's policy, or when it comes to the police department or any other department, and the discretion. That's where I wanted to see, and what difference, what is in front of us is what you were already doing, and if it's changed in terms of policy and direction. And that's where my line of curiosity was coming from. And what I understood from you is this just reaffirms of already what you were doing. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? Okay, Councillor Young is, it's on the, has the amendment been voted on yet? Oh, wow, we really strayed. Okay, on the amendment, all those in favor? Any opposed? Okay, on the main motion, all those in favor? Yes, sorry, we need to extend the meeting again. It's 2:15 now, so can I have a motion to extend the meeting to, okay, move till 2:30. Councillor Alto by Councillor Dubeau, seconded by Councillor, all those in favor? Any opposed? Okay, Councillor Dubeau, go ahead before I call the question.
Yeah, are you calling the question the whole motion?
I am.
Then I will make a statement before I vote it on.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And it's going to be a bit long, but I'll make it faster so that I can make my point in terms of, I really appreciate that we're having this discussion, and my line of question was just to see what direction would this motion send, and it was to me clear, sorry with my language, business will be as usual, but with the discretion of the work that was happening. And to me, when we've read a lot of letters from the BCLA, the BC Civil Liberties, BIVET, and other organizations, and I always, on council, I've been consistent when it comes to human rights and harm reduction approach, and we put people first over any city beautification or because this is the reality, and this crisis really highlighted the crisis we have in our community, and we cannot hide. It's visible, and that is the reality in our community. And this is something that has been there before the coronavirus, but the virus brought it, the inequality and all the how some people in our community are suffering. So the city needs a cohesive and consistent plan when it comes to housing first, inclusive, participatory, keeps community and family networks intact. A component of the planning that we do has to consider how to maintain the community social networks by creating housing opportunity with close proximity of the incumbent. Any incumbent plan has to be participatory, recognizing the incumbents are rights claim, and unhoused and homeless are rights order. Furthermore, housing and health are connected. The displacement through forced evictions or the use of bylaws has far-reaching social and health implication, and this has nothing to do with the officers. This has to do with the implications of some of our city policies might have, particularly for racialized and indigenous groups. It's imperative that we respect and fulfill and protect the rights of indigenous people, particularly their right to self-determination. And according to the international human rights law, forced eviction, displacement, and relocation of indigenous people in the absence of free, period, and informed consent is a rights violation. And I have difficulty with this motion for me to vote on. In my opinion, it does not go as far as I would have hoped to see to address human rights and emergency being experienced by people who are sheltering outside in dual with the public health crisis of COVID and the overdose epidemic. It does not address the layers that have received many organizations and individuals, including human rights experts, indigenous organizations, and service providers. And I hope that we would have shared those letters to the public so the public is aware of the things I'm reading in my inbox and all the letters that I have received and the council has received. And many has showed concern in the community members informing us of the impacts of the May 14 notice. It's really important, and again, and I know that the council agrees with, when we approach an issue from human rights perspective, it reminds us that each and every one of us is worthy of our consideration and care. This is a helpful reminder in the world where majority rule is often the dominant mentality and the way of operating. As we have seen in numerous situations, once we start justifying actions that disregard one's persons or communities worthy, we exacerbate risks and create additional rifts in our social fabric. Approaching an issue from human rights perspective also provides insight to the practical strategies for engaging in a thorough decision-making process, including those who have lived experience in a more holistic decision. And human rights approach reminds us that those who are most impacted by particular decision or set of decision hold valuable sites and can provide crucial information that leadership takes seriously and will strengthen the relevance and the resilience of the decision. And I think this will pass. Because of that, I cannot vote on this because it does not go as far as I would hoped.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Isaac?
I hope a majority of council members support this. Having had several meetings with Councillor Dubois on this issue, I was open to whatever wording he would have proposed, but I've had a very busy week, and this is the best motion I was able to put together with Councillors Loveday and Potts, but I guess we just do the work we can to the capacity we have. I think it strikes a balance between the rights of the unhoused and tries to more clearly enumerate their right to not have their belongings seized and disposed of unless that's absolutely necessary. It provides a grace period, which wasn't previously specified in the notices that were posted on different shelters. And it also encourages, with the amendments from Councillor Alto, encourages our staff to store rather than dispose if that can be achieved in a manner consistent with public health advice and workplace safety requirements. So I think this motion proposes a policy that is stronger than the status quo in terms of the rights of the unhoused and ensuring dignity and human rights for people without homes. So I hope a majority of council members will support it because the status quo provides less protections for the most marginalized community members.
Okay, I'm going to go to Councillor Thornton-Joe, Councillor Dubois, and Councillor Loveday.
A point of privilege, as someone mentioned my name, I would love to respond to that.
Okay, you can.
Thank you, and I will come to my colleagues. I think it's one of the reasons why I didn't vote for this is, and the discussion I had, I read a lot on the letters we received, but also I read the National Protocol for Human Homeless Encampment in Canada. There is a report, and anyone that wants to read is available online, and it came, I believe, April 29th from the UN Housing Rapporteur, and is particularly speaking to in Canada. So what stood out for me in that article, the National Protocol, in addition to the obligation of the government, and when I say government is local, provincial, and federal, to install infrastructure and maintenance for basic services. And is that encampment is simultaneously human rights violation and rights claim. I think it's really important for us to lean the reality that encampments are result of governments failing and failings, but also it's human rights that can be violated. And that's why at the beginning when I was asking the questions, the staff stated that this is just an affirmation of what's already the officers are doing, and that's the way I understood. And I didn't see more strength that I would have hoped, and that's my reasoning of voting and not supporting it. But if it might fail, then I don't know what will be.
I don't think it's going to fail. I think we could probably.
Yeah, that's what I
think we should probably vote soon.
And then I vote against in principle to show that it's not go as far as we hoped it to go.
Thank you. I agreed you, or I permitted you a latitude on the point of privilege. Councillor Isaac, no side talk. Councillor, I don't remember if it was Loveday or Thornton-Joe that was next. Councillor Thornton-Joe and then Councillor Loveday. You guys were in a meeting. Councillor Thornton-Joe, you have the floor, and then Councillor Loveday.
Thank you. Thank you for the amendments. I think the amendments make it more supportable. I do realize I still have one more issue, maybe my question to Ms. Perkins again. A says that council directs staff not to remove shelters and belongings that are abandoned or unoccupied. So, for example, in some locations in some of the parks, we've had several emails about just garbage being left, and I guess, and neither no one there or pictures of just litter. And so I guess garbage or litter or abandoned belongings, I guess, is a matter of interpretation. So what I'm concerned is does that prevent you or Mr. Souyer's staff, if they encounter a camp and see litter or see things that is now a mess or a nuisance, that they can't touch anything because of what it states here?
We still have the ability under the bylaw to dispose of things that are, and Tom might be helpful with the language, there's like noxious things, and I can't remember what is all this legalese, but basically trash, we can get rid of. And, you talk about bike parts, but there's sometimes are bike parts valuable to some person and not to another. So we try to negotiate those types of things to make sure that we try to identify ownership before we get rid of things that are questionable, but things that are clearly garbage and trash or wet and soiled and that type of thing will continue to do that work.
So it doesn't prevent you from doing that?
Yeah, but if it's questionable, we definitely try to
communicate with the
yes,
individual.
Exactly.
Okay, with that, I think it makes it a little bit more supportable, and as well as that we'll be revisiting this on June 25th. I understand why I came forward. I understand the need and the concerns for those that are unhoused. But I think this strikes a little bit more of a balance and takes away a little bit less confusion than the original motion without the amendments had.
Thank you. Councillor Loveday and then Councillor Alto and then Councillor Young. Okay, I need another motion to extend the meeting. And okay, to 2:45. Councillor Alto, is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Dubois. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. Okay, Councillor Loveday.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that this doesn't represent what is currently our policy. It is a significant policy shift towards protecting the rights of our most vulnerable residents. The first item is council reaffirming direction that our bylaw staff have chosen to make using their discretion. And one of my colleagues mentioned that discretion is not something that we should be relying on. This actually takes away the discretion and says that initial direction that bylaw has taken is the correct one. And so we essentially are affirming the discretion that had been in place. And because, for many reasons, one of which is that it aligns with the public health statements from the public health officials. The second part is looking at, basically we're saying that we as a council believe that items should, if they're taken, they should be impounded instead of disposed of. That right now, if there's any items that are taken, and our bylaw officers are very thoughtful in this approach and are not confiscating willy-nilly in any way, and but this is saying that we want, as a council, we want them to be held so that they can get them back and they won't just be thrown out. And I think that is a significant departure from what's currently happening. And we're saying we only want that to happen, of course, if it's safe for both public health and workplace safety. And I think that's significant. And then we finish by saying that we want more communication with the people who are most impacted. And that means the people who are vulnerable and living in the parks, as well as the organizations that represent them, and that I think this dialogue will be very helpful to make sure that human rights are respected and we reached the appropriate policy and practice as we move forward, so that we can mitigate unintended harms. So I think this number 3 is important, and we're lucky to have staff that are taking this on already, but this makes it council direction, which means it's official policy of the city, which I think is important. If discretion is we're trying to steer away from discretion and do it with policy, then this proposal, and I think it has been strengthened with the amendments, is I think it's a proposal that does do that and puts this in policy at least until June 25th, to make sure that people have their rights upheld. And I see this as responding to a lot of the letters and a lot of the concerns that have been being raised. If any of my colleagues have proposals that will further human rights more, I would look forward to voting on those and seeing what comes forward, but none of those came forward today. And this is forward in front of us, and I really hope that it passes, because it will make the lives of people who are taking shelter in the parks better.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Alto, and then Councillor Young.
I won't add to the excellent comments that have been made by all. I just wanted to ask a question, and that was, I wonder if there is time sensitivity sufficient to this to have it sent to our council meeting this afternoon, or?
Yes, I think that's a good idea.
All right, so I think I need to make a 5th addition amendment there just to forward this item to the council meeting later today.
Okay, moved and seconded. Discussion?
No.
All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. Okay. Councillor Young is opposed. Okay. No. Just to moving it forward to today. Okay. Councillor Young, and then I want the floor so I can move that we call the question. But Councillor Young is first.
Yeah, quite apart from the whole principle of moving exactly in the wrong direction, this presents all kinds of practical difficulties. It does remove the discretion of bylaw to order the removal of tents that are vast assemblages of multiple tents in Beacon Hill Park. And the other day I noticed one that was basically 10 feet high and 20 feet wide, all tarped in. So we've taken that discretion away. The wording that says what it says is, will not remove belongings that are abandoned until 72 hours. Basically, that includes garbage, folks. The difference between belongings that have been abandoned and garbage is absolutely unknowable. And one person's garbage is another person's belongings. We are tethering our bylaw staff. We are basically ordering the creation of a new tent camp in Beacon Hill Park with this motion, and I just think it's a deplorable direction for us to be going.
Okay, that's actually not at all what's happening. Ms. Perkins, do you interpret this motion to go set up a
Doesn't matter how, we can't ask the staff to interpret a motion that we are in the course of passing. This motion is giving direction. We're not asking our staff how they interpret an order by us that abandoned belongings.
Sorry.
As one of the people who wrote the motion,
doesn't matter what you say either, Councillor Loveday. It's not the mover of the motion's intent that matters. It's what the motion says.
Okay, hold on. If we could, I'm the chair. Councillor Young, you had ceded the floor and I had begun to speak. You had interrupted me. That's fine. Let's call it a point of personal privilege. I now have the floor, and then I'll go to Councillor Loveday as the mover. There are words here on the screen. We always ask our staff before we vote on something, how do you interpret this direction? So I'll just ask you instead of trying to put words in your mouth.
It says that council directs staff not to remove shelters and belongings that are abandoned or unoccupied. But that doesn't prevent us from enforcing the rules that we have, which are that structures are a certain height and that they don't take up a certain amount of space. So this doesn't, in my opinion, prevent us from enforcing those rules that we have set in place for the park, for the health and safety. So this, to me, talks about things that are left abandoned and they're not there when we go there, or they're not there the next day. We just want to remove those things. So to me, it doesn't tie my hands that way to deal with large structures that shouldn't be there to begin with. And we will still have those conversations with folks who have those large structures to try to get them to move to a smaller structure.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Zaworski, do you have some advice for us?
Mayor Helps, I do, but I think that that's advice that council should receive in closed meeting.
Okay, well, whenever our solicitor wants to give us information in closed meeting, I think it's wise for us to take it. So, Mr. Coates, can you outline the section of the community charter that would allow us to go into camera to receive legal advice? At the same time, let's make a motion to extend the meeting. I have a meeting with Minister Robinson at 3:30, so let's say 3:30 and hope for the best, and that means council might have to go in camera with me, without me at our, when we do for okay, moved by Councillor Dubois. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Alto. If we don't need till 3:30, all the better, because we still do have more in closed business to do. But all those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. So that extends our meeting until 3:30. Mr. Coates, the section to close the meeting, please.
Section 91I of the Community Charter regarding received advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege.
For those reasons, could we have a motion to close the meeting? Did we have a motion to? That was a meeting to. That was a motion to extend to 3:30. Thank you, Councillor Loveday. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Dubois. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. I'd like to call the open meeting back to order, and Councillor Loveday was about to have the floor when we closed it, so I'm going to hand the floor to Councillor Loveday. Go ahead.
Yeah, the motion is doesn't the intent of the motion isn't to change any of the direction in the bylaw regarding. Basically, it doesn't mention the things that Councillor Young was bringing up. And that was on purpose. It was mentioning things that wanting to give policy direction to staff regarding the impoundment of property and looking, but it doesn't specifically doesn't mention changing the requirements regarding other things that are being enforced. For example, the having fires and that kind of thing, which I think is very reasonable in a dry park. So I just want to make sure that we're not, that everyone at the council table and the public who's listening knows that this isn't council saying we want to open a new tent city. That is not what this says at all. It says that we want to make sure that people and people's belongings and their shelters are respected in terms of that that they aren't going to be disposed of, that if we can in fact impound them and keep them so they can get them back. These are the types of things that we're looking at.
Okay, I feel like this has been adequately debated, and I'd like to call the question. I'm going to do it as a roll call. Councillor Alto?
In favor.
Councillor Dubois?
And after listening to the legal, in favor.
Okay, Councillor Isaac?
In favor.
Okay, I'm in favor. Councillor Loveday? In favor. Councillor Potts?
In favor.
Councillor Thornton-Joe?
In favor.
Councillor Young?
Opposed.
Okay, the motion carries. Thank you. And thanks for, I think it did get better through amendment. And I was going to apologize for losing my temper. I'm not sure if I did, but I find it very hard when everyone starts talking at once in a meeting that we're trying to follow our rules of order and do our best to act as the government of the city. But the next thing we do need is a motion to adjourn. Thank you. Moved by Councillor Alto. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor.
Point of personal privilege. I think, Mayor, you were restoring decorum in the chamber and upholding the rules of order.
Thank you. That is what I was trying to do. I appreciate that. It's the first time I'd ever wished for a gavel. Okay. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. The meeting is adjourned.